as you watch the world you once knew crumble down around you, and as you see humanity disappear and be replaced with grotesque flesh monsters, you might take comfort in having your wits about you, but in Lone Survivor, the only thing more dangerous than your mind is your past. There's no commonly agreed upon answer for where the monsters came from, but the symptoms of infection and mutations are many and varied. Infection is communicated through both physical contact from infected persons to uninfected persons via scratches, bites, and projectile spit, and airborne transmission from presumably pockets of infection that put off spores of some kind. We can confirm both of these modes from people who had the misfortune of contracting this disease in-game. From first, the expecting couple, who from a broken window were infected with the airborne version, and later from the gun store squatter Hank, who contracted the person-to-person version of the disease. It's also from these characters that we get a very detailed account of the symptoms of an infected person. A list of symptoms in an extremely rough order of when they might appear include itchiness, loss of appetite, confusion, loss of memory, sensitivity to light, aggressive behavior, headaches, vivid night terrors, slurred speech, fatigue, twitchiness, and disassociation from reality. Hank is one of our earliest accounts for an in-game timeline, as it appears the currently in-production prequel Lone Warrior will be featuring him. After some kind of an adventure underground in the subway tunnels, Hank climbs up to the city through a sewer grate in the ground, already having been infected previously. He explores the city and finds a set of keys to the local apartment building, where our protagonist, referred to as You, has locked himself away in his room. Hank finds the keys to room 205, which he uses as a base for a couple of weeks. It's here where Hank would run a line from the nearby pylon, which still miraculously had electricity, to the computer in his room, where Hank would spend his time making and listening to music and browsing the ruins of the internet until he hoarded enough ammunition and food to scavenge the city itself. He then finds another key, this time to the local gun and ammo store, and resolves to hole himself up there for the foreseeable future as his infection takes hold, but not before taking the key to the bedroom of 205 and hiding it behind the nearby hall plant named Chuck. This is where Hank's story pauses for now, and Yu's story picks up. The game begins with Yu lamenting how they've been surviving the outbreak for a long time as a recluse. How long it's been, you're not sure, but it's been a long time. You're then dropped into a dream sequence where you walk across a stage and enjoy some coffee near a man with a box on his head facing away from you. Right after this, you learn that for every enemy, you're afforded the opportunity to sneak around them instead of fighting them. And at the end of the stage, you run into a girl with long black hair and a blue dress. When you try to talk to her, she disappears and drops a flashlight. When you turn the flashlight on, a man flashes very briefly on the screen who wears a blue shirt and has a big red hole in his chest. Yu then wakes in a start and begins exploring the apartment. Some things of note are a diary that Yu keeps that tracks what you've done previously in the game, a radio that gives you a hint to your next step in the game if you're ever lost, and a kitchen that contains the key to leave the apartment, a fridge full of rotten meat, and a plush cat doll named Sleepy Cat. As you exit the apartment, you'll find a nearby map with a note that says how the monsters are attracted to that rotting meat, and you can use it like bait to bait them where you want them. You can then use this strategy to sneak by monsters in the game instead of shooting them, and your corresponding psych evaluation at the end of the game will reflect your behavior throughout the game. For example, if you solve all your problems by shooting them, eat unhealthy food, or take medicine detrimental to your health, your psyche will suffer. However, if you eat good cooked meals, sneak past enemies, and are considerate both of your fellow man and of your own well-being, your psych evaluation will be better at the end of the game. Continuing on now, your current goal is to go to your neighbor Chi's apartment, and after navigating through monsters and a long fleshy corridor, you make your way there only to find the apartment seemingly untouched by the destruction that plagues the rest of the city. Unblemished walls and clean furniture reflect an apartment that's disconnected from the new sick world. Fitting with the theme, as you enter the living room of the house, you'll find three people who are partying unaware of the state of the world. You talk to the girl whose name's Chi and is a friend of Yu's, who asks you to bring her a vaguely referred hers doll to her, and that she won't say anything else until you do. The other two party guests, Benzito and Kenny, are much more indulgent to you, but much less lucid, only quipping for you to calm down and enjoy the party, while you urges them to snap back to reality. After getting the doll and giving it to Chi, she asks you to meet her outside on the balcony where she waits for you with a gun. She tells you to just take it, and once you do, Chi suddenly disappears. When you make your way back through the apartment where there was a party moments ago, there are now corpses and monsters, and the apartment as a whole now reflects how the rest of reality looks. After some more back and forth between the neighboring apartments, you'll hear a girl calling for help, and once you find her, it's again the girl in the blue dress referred to as simply her. You ask her how you might be able to help and get her out of the cage she's in, but she screams at you to stay away from her and that she didn't want you to find her like this. She then disappears as you begins to have a breakdown. Suddenly, you notice a card on the ground advertising the services of the director, who is a professional acquisitions expert. You're able to pick up the director's frequency, who says to come to room 204, a formerly locked apartment. When you get there are childlike drawings made with pencils and chalk depicting a girl with wings, and another of the girl kissing a man facing from the camera. All the way in the back, we can finally meet the director, a very kind man who offers you items for free that he happens to collect on his journey that he doesn't need. While we're here and talking about the director, let's talk about all his uses and quests too. When you talk to the director, he'll give you different items depending on your mental state. If it's high enough, he'll give you fruit drops, which helps use memory and give you different dialogue about certain areas of the game. The director also acts as a trader, and he'll give you 3 flares for every 10 bullets that you trade him. And flares act as a means of stunning the monsters in this game. The director also says some interesting things well before the end game, like when he makes you guess how he's been able to survive so long in the pandemic, to which you guesses that he isn't real. And the director acts indignant, saying that he's real alright. Then one time, while asking the director why he gives you so much stuff, he says that he doesn't have a use for it anyways. We'll touch on these things later in the video. For now though, we can take all our new supplies and information and head down to the landing floor of the apartment. It's much more infested with monsters, and in the entryway for the apartment is a giant monster called in the game files Daddy. Then you has an encounter in the apartment's back alley with a white-faced man who promises you answers the 3rd time that you see him before disappearing. You make your way to the basement through a labyrinth of destroyed architecture and zombies, and if you read a red occult book in your apartment completely through, you'll unlock a new door you can open if you combine a pair of eyes with a heart and a brain. Inside, we can find a note for a character we've seen referenced on notes throughout the game called Draco, who starts out by saying that he can't trust anyone, and the best way to deal with the monsters is to put a bullet in them and put them down. He also advises to only come out at night, as the daylight irritates the monsters and makes them more active, irritated, and plentiful. Draco believes in survival at any cost, and when you unlock this new secret area, you can read his 4th and final note of the game, where he welcomes you to his world. We'll talk more about Draco later, but for now you fight your way through a horde of enemies and unlock orifices and cut tendons inside what seems to be a body until you suddenly appear in an elevator with real people in it. You hide in the back of the elevator from their prying eyes, and as the elevator ascends, the people turn into monsters and the elevator begins to drop. The monsters attack you until suddenly you wake up back in your apartment again. Back in the basement, you can run into what the game calls a writhing thing, which looks to be a person inside of a heart. If you choose to shoot the heart, you begin a hallucination sequence where you walk down a hole until you run into her again, who lambasts you for abandoning her until she melts before your very eyes. This interaction drops your sanity 2 whole letter levels in the psych report, and what I personally believe to be happening here isn't necessarily a penalty for an unneeded show of force, but I think when you shoot the heart, it probably puts off infectious spores that cause you to hallucinate. This is just conjecture though, and your guess is as good as mine, but the theory might make more sense as you progress further in this story and hear some of my final conclusions. From here in the basement, the objective is to fire up a backup generator, and when you enter the room where the generator is, there's instead a grotesque figure that looks a lot like a bloody feminine angel. A splitting headache suddenly strikes you, and a cutscene then plays of you and her overlooking the horizon on a hillside next to a tree. You and her talk, but you says he doesn't remember who she is. Her says to stop kidding and to make like you used to when you were kids, and count to 1,000,000 and come and find her. Then, just as quickly as the hallucination came on, it fades back to the generator room, with the figure having been replaced with the generator. After booting the generator up, you call an elevator to the basement that contains the trapped Daddy monster inside of it, who tears the elevator doors open and chases after you all throughout the basement. Once you make your way back to the basement landing, Daddy is no longer able to pursue you, and you're relatively safe and entirely free to exit the apartment building and explore the rest of the city. Very near to the apartment, you're likely to find the gun and ammo shop, where a Thin Man monster lurks. Sneaking past or killing the monster, you can knock on the back door where surprisingly a human welcomes you to the back room of the gun shop. That human, of course, is none other than Hank from before, who says that he's become confused and itchy after having been infected by one of the monsters, and that it's only a matter of time until he turns. Hank then offers the player a trade of 1 blue pill for 10 bullets. But first, let's step away to talk about pills in Lone Survivor, as I've neglected to talk about them until now. So what are the pills in Lone Survivor? There are 3 colors of pills, those being green pills, blue pills, and red pills, coupling what characters say when they take them with a bit of context from a Rock Paper Shotgun article interviewing Jasper Byrne, the creator of Lone Survivor, from 2012, a few months after the game's initial release. The colors in-game represent different things, the colors themselves being uniform. For example, the blue pills, the blue ending, and the man in the blue shirt all represent nature in the nature versus nurture debate in psychology. If you're unfamiliar, nature versus nurture is the debate between how much of a person's characteristics are comprised of their genetic nature and how much of it is attributed to a person's environment. To put it in even simpler terms, imagine a pair of twins who act very similar in some ways, those ways being debatably in their nature, and different in other ways, those ways being a result of the different environmental exposures of the two people. Getting back to the game, it's been blatantly stated that blue represents the nature side of things, a predisposition to acting the way someone does, a more primal and instinctual way of approaching the apocalypse, like shooting the problems in your way, and eating food regardless of the nutritional value or the taste of said food, just because of its apparent readiness. In the inverse, green in-game represents nurture, the human element, compassion to a stranger despite the genetic instinct to want to use it for yourself, bothering to cook food and considering how healthy or nutritious a meal is before eating it. That's the specific divide between blue and green in Lone Survivor, and in the psych report at the end of the game, the blue pill hurts your sanity when you take them, and the green pill boosts it. Of course, if you take a blue pill, you visit the man in blue, and if you take a green pill, you visit this man with a box on his head near a cabin at what appears to be a desert. To hear characters describe it, both pills have a sort of dulling effect, and if you choose to give Hank more and more blue pills, his infection takes a stronger and stronger hold until he eventually disappears, and you thinks he's surely been taken by the infection. The red pills are the last pills in the game, and seem to be an adrenaline of some kind. It gets rid of any sleepiness you may have had, and characters describe it as similar to the blue pills but with side effects. Blue pills seem to also have a numbing effect, whereas red pills seem to have a more adrenaline effect described as a kick in the chops. Of course, all these pills and their colors have a direct correlation to the endings, but let's wait to cross that bridge until we get to it. If you trade Hank 10 blue pills, he'll disappear as mentioned before, and in the time leading up to the last trade, he'll mention that he's feeling worse until he becomes delusional and disappears. On the other hand, if you trade him some rare health tonics contained throughout the game, of which there are 10 total, he'll start to feel more and more better until his name changes color in his dialogue box, and he mentions his intent to leave the city however he's able to as soon as he can. After this encounter, Hank disappears from the city never to be seen again. In another encounter near the gun store, you run into the man in blue again, who asks if you know him, and if you answer yes, your sanity takes a hit and he starts dancing with Chi, and if you say no, a similar thing happens but it raises sanity and he begins dancing with her. You can continue to explore the city and scavenge for things that might help you, and in front of the hospital you can even find a cat which you can tame with cat food and invite into your apartment where he becomes a welcome guest and friend. To progress the game, you head through the Super Flat World arcade, where you can see some references to some of Jasper's other games, and even a cabinet for Lone Survivor itself. Here, you'll also run into the white-faced man, who's again cryptic, but says this is his second encounter with you, and his next and final encounter will come with answers. From here, using items we've collected from around the city, we can enact the climax of the game and start the final boss. But first, let's explore quickly an area new to Super Lone Survivor, the western side of the city. Here, you'll find some more houses and restaurants, none of which you can go in. Then you can find a metro, which you can go inside and fight a horde of monsters for a health tonic. We also come across 2 new areas side by side, which are very interesting for both different and similar reasons. The first area is a bombing site, where presumably some tenement was the victim of a bombing in an effort to fight the monsters and infection. What's unique about this though, is how upset it makes you. You talks about finding the person who did this and making them pay, and how there were civilians who evidently got hurt in the bombing. Next to this, we can see a desert, and as we go through it, we see a huge field of blood, guts, and gore and a locked gate. Breaking the gate open, we're dropped at the back entrance of a hospital with an ambulance nearby, and monsters prowl scouring the nearby area. When you enter the back entrance, you're suddenly in a morgue and can approach the only container that's open, which contains her. If you have high sanity, Yu says that they know what they have to do next and are suddenly dropped back at home. Then if you have low sanity, you scream at her saying you can't go through this again. Her then gets angry and asks why you keep giving up right before the end and that this isn't the right way to her, before grabbing you from the container and teleporting you back home. And that's all to the new west side of the city. From here we can go ahead through the bus doors and start our fight with the final boss of the game called Mother. You might notice through the fog some carnage and nothing at all around, which becomes even more evident after you beat Mother, either by shooting her or avoiding her attacks until she walks away, where you'll find the director again surrounded by nothingness and a big gash on his chest. He tells you that he explored a little bit too far this time, and before dying, the director directs you towards the hospital where he says she's waiting on you, and that the director misses her too before dying. Yu finds a code to the hospital on the director's body, and you can finally begin the ending sequence and get one of 5 endings available as a result of your decisions throughout the game. Starting from the lowest sanity to the highest sanity ending, endings red and blue are very similar to one another. Yu finds their name on a chart at the hospital, and then goes to their supposed room number, and when you enter the room the door shuts behind you. You take a blue pill that sits on a nearby table and lay in bed until you wake up back on the stage from the beginning of the game, and that we've seen every time that we've seen the man in blue. Speaking of the man in blue, who is he? We've established that he's meant to represent the human nature of self-interest and survival at any cost, but does he also represent something else? Someone we've heard about a time or two throughout the game already? While getting resources together and ready for this video, I ripped the sprites and found an interesting one called Draco, who is none other than the man in blue. If data mining, whether accidental or otherwise, makes you sick, we can pretend I saw it on Jasper's devlog from 7 years ago, where he happens to show a list of sprites at one point, and you can see the same thing. Throughout the game, Draco, or the man in blue, constantly berates Yu about how they know one another and how they're not so different, and acknowledging the similarities between the two of you hurts your sanity. So knowing all of that, what does it mean? I think Draco is the ultimate fear of our protagonist, besides of course her, which we'll talk about shortly. Draco represents the kind of person you become when you cut corners and sacrifice your morals to survive, and it's those same decisions throughout the game that award you the red and blue endings, which will continue now having all that in mind. At the end of the stage you walk across, you run into Draco, who continues to mock you for asking who he is. Yu then pulls their gun on him and demands he be quiet, but the man in blue keeps mocking you until he's shot in the chest. The difference between the red and the blue ending here is in the red ending, the bullet hole that appears on Draco's chest also appears on Yu's chest. The screen then cuts to some ruins in a desert surrounding a city, as a Yu who now wears a blue shirt sits with her overlooking said city. Yu says that this is where it all ends, and her asks if you aren't happy to be here at least, to which you respond that there's no place he'd rather be than here with her right now. So what do I think the red and blue ending mean exactly? Well, Draco is solidified in this ending as being a personification of the man Yu is feared becoming, as Yu and Draco's faces swap as the screen flashes in the final cutscene. Something long since theorized was that this ending represented Yu killing himself in a literal sense of the word, figuratively represented by shooting Draco and the hole appearing in Yu's chest. This theory I originally didn't submit to, because I felt the blue ending represented the acknowledgement of Draco as a part of your personality, and the two coexisting in this post-apocalyptic world in Yu's mind to survive, and the difference between the red and the blue ending with the bullet hole was that Yu's personality was erased, and Draco's was the only one left, though the endings are identical otherwise. But I'm starting to come around to the idea that this might be a literal death as well, with the inclusion of a trigger warning written by Bryce that says the game contains themes of PTSD, social isolation, and self-harm. The only other time something self-harm related is ever mentioned is in some intro dialogue with Hank, where you can suggest Hank killing himself to stop the infection. There's evidence enough to argue either theory, either the literal or figurative death of Yu, and I still think I'm in the figurative death camp, but I can see where the literal death arguments are coming from. The next ending is the green ending, and plays the same way up until you enter the final room from the other endings. You take a green pill on the stand nearby and lie in bed, and after a few moments the white-faced man appears on the screen representing the third time you see him, and the truths that are about to follow that he promised when you first met. As his face fades, you can see you standing next to the bed where her now rests with bandages on her head, blood here and there, and hooked to machines monitoring her vitals. She tells you she was only kidding about having you come and find her, and asks a promise from you to look after yourself until things are back to normal, and then to leave the city. We then see you traveling through the desert, and then sitting on a hill alone in the desert overlooking the city. Her promises that everything will be alright, and that they'll be together again one day. The scene cuts to an older you sitting on a green hill from your memories of her, with her's doll beside him, until he stands and the screen fades to white. So, what does the green ending mean? Well, let's talk about the difference between the environments and the endings we've seen so far. The red and blue ending features heavily the destroyed city and the desert, which we've seen as we approach the outskirts of the city and the back of the hospital from earlier, and is also where we've seen the man with the box on his head's cabin. Of course, here in the green ending, the desert's been replaced with a flush hill from the past, but you is older. I think the desert represents how you sees the world. The blue and red ending is a city surrounded by desert because in Yu's mind the only place that exists is here where she was, and where she'll forever be in Yu's mind. But in the green ending, it's the beginning of Yu being able to let go and realize that a future outside of the city and outside of her still exists. Of course, he has some hang-ups still, which is why he still carries her doll in this ending. More interestingly though, what happened to her exactly? We see her covered in bandages, bloodied, and on presumably life support in this ending, but why? Well, the pieces have been across the game, and if we bring them all together, we finally have the full picture. Before we exit the apartment building we start in, we have to travel through an apartment room and into the back alley. It's here we can find the newspaper clippings talking about a civilian who was the victim of a bombing in some war. Yu acts indifferent to the newspaper clip after saying that wars have long since passed. But moving on to the next piece of evidence, let's look at how Yu reacts to a couple of destroyed tenements. Similar to when Yu has breakdowns, blackouts, and hallucinations, he also reacts very strongly to seeing these places that look like bombing sites, saying uncharacteristically that whoever is responsible for these bombings deserves to rot. This is odd because even in the face of monsters, while reading the thoughts of Draco, while looking at the destruction all around him usually, Yu never reacts like this to the environment or people, notwithstanding high stress moments like talking with her, confronting Draco, or fighting or fleeing giant monsters. But there's one last piece of evidence to give us the final context we need to get the full story. The radio gives us hints throughout the game of where to go next. While normally it doesn't give us any exposition, it gives us a very important piece of the story right after meeting the white-faced man for the second time, but before fighting Mother. Referring to the bus right before fighting Mother, we get several important radio messages like where it all happened, find the bus you know she was in. And if you remember the environment where we fought Mother, it's mostly desolation, destruction, and nothing. Then once you beat Mother and continue to where we find the director, we find him in the heart of all this destruction, injured and dying. Draw whatever evident conclusions you'd like about the dying director's placement here in the place where Yu's life was forever changed, where she was the civilian that was the victim of this bombing. This is why we see her on a hospital bed, bloodied, bandaged, and connected to machines keeping her alive. And then in her's final moments, she asks you to look after yourself and to leave the city and her behind. While I'm not willing to die on this hill, I think there's a story you can actually follow if you piece together portions of what her says throughout the game, and if you reorder them from the order they appear in-game. Following this supposed story, you and her sit overlooking the city one day. Her then asks you to count to 1,000,000 and then come find her like when the two of you were kids. Then back in the city, her ends up the victim of a bombing, being lethally injured but not dead. Her then says that she never wanted you to find her, not like this anyway, likely referring to the injuries from the bombing. The two of you then rush to the hospital where she lies dying, and her final words are what we see here in the green ending. Before we talk about who you and her even are, let's go over the last significant ending of the game, the white ending. The white ending has you going down an alternate hallway than the one you've gone down for the other endings, with you quipping that he's terrified thinking what might be down this hallway. When you go down it, the walls have human-like features like skin and faces and intestines, and when you get about halfway down the hallway, you find the body of her, who rises in response to your presence and gives chase. If she catches you, you'll instantly die, die, and if you try to use any mitigating tools like flares, bullets, or rotten meat, her neck will grow and she'll screech, dealing damage to you and calling all the monsters from the back of this arena to the front to kill you. You win by sneaking past her, the same way you likely have done all the other enemies in the white ending so far. Red and white lights flash in the background here, obviously an allusion to ambulance lights, until you make your way to the very back of the room. The scene transitions to you in a white hospital room with a glass of water that when you drink and lie down in the bed, the white-faced man appears again and her shortly afterwards. You is now lying in bed holding the purple doll and says how this is all wrong and she's supposed to be in the bed, not you. Her says that you should throw that doll away and it's always creeped her out. She then says you has grown a lot since the time she asked him to leave the city and about how he's become a completely different person since then. The screen pans to the same images from the green ending, except notably when you sits on the hill overlooking the city, the purple doll has been replaced with his sleepy cat doll. You says that he misses her, and she says that's alright as long as you keep moving forward, and if he does, they'll see each other again one day, no doubt. The screen then fades, and that's the white ending. So what does this one mean? People for a long time have used the white ending as evidence that you is actually in a mental institution of some sort for the events of the game, coupled with the post-game psych reports detailing the choices you made that led to the ending you got. I, however, think this is the final point in our story of her that takes place in a time later than the last ending when we saw her in a hospital dying. You has kept the memento of her doll around, and the hallucination, apparition, or whatever you might call it, has come to give you closure. To be clear, I think this is more you creating a goodbye to her to allow him to move on. The same hers that he imagines damning him in some hallucinations for not finding her. The difference, of course, being that this is a her that you has created for closure, telling him to throw away the doll and that she never cared for it much anyways, which we do see him do in this ending, adopting his doll in the ending sequence, instead symbolizing him getting over her enough to move on. This is why when Yu says that he misses her, she doesn't say, "I'll miss you too," or "I love you," but instead says that missing her is okay, as long as Yu moves on. So the white ending is Yu finally moving on from her, and the city both, leaving behind everything except for the memories you can afford to carry with you. But who are you and her? For years, there's been a lot of discourse over whether you and her are siblings, or lovers, as the game purposely takes care to never mention, but I think I have enough of a case to finally say one way or the other. My first piece of evidence: in the apartment where Yu stays for the course of the game, he's willing to interact with certain things in the apartment and not willing to interact with other things. For example, Yu interacts with everything in his bedroom and in the kitchen, from cooking to sleeping. But in the master bedroom, he won't interact with presumably some shoes of hers that he makes a point of saying aren't his. The same thing happens when you interact with the bedside table and a nearby cabinet. But when you interact with the other bedside table, Yu says that there's nothing of interest in there, in contrast to everything else in the room where he says it isn't his. Yu won't sleep in the bed here, just because he doesn't want to, just for the record to cover everything in the room. But that's not all. There's some drawings in the director's apartment, and some of those drawings you will comment on. And not only that, you will have different things to say depending on if your sanity level is high or low. If it's high, you will actually say, "Drawings in black pencil of a girl about my age. She looks nice." A girl about your age may be the implication that they're not younger or older than you, since it bothers to mention a girl your age. Of course, you can have a sibling a year or two younger or older than you, and it could still be about your age. But I think with the totality of the circumstances, you might see it more in a romantic light than a sibling light. Speaking of which, the next significant and final piece of evidence I present is in the same apartment with similar drawings, but a drawing that you can't comment on. A drawing that you can't even see very well unless you get rid of the fog and shading. The drawing is the scene of you and her overlooking the city on the hillside in a childlike drawing style, but this drawing has her facing you and planting a smooch on his cheek surrounded by hearts. Again, kind of grasping at straws here, but this isn't exactly how I would imagine adult siblings expressing love between one another. And for that matter, this again isn't a hill I'm really prepared to die on either. It's just the conclusion I personally drew from what I found in the game. So, let's now do the last ending of the game and a proper wrap-up of all the smaller elements I didn't mention until now. The last ending, The yellow ending can only take place in New Game Plus. In the normal game, if you try to give your doll the sleepy cat to another NPC, you says that they're not yet ready to do that. But if you play on New Game Plus, you can try to give it to different NPCs in the game for different random, usually food related items. If you try to give it to Chi in her apartment though, you'll say that you'd rather stay here with her and her friends instead of going back out into that horrible world. Then a small dance party ensues. I honestly don't think the yellow ending means anything. With the other colors like blue and green for example, there's color correlation with the themes of the games and endings, but I think this is just a joke ending. Similar to the joke endings from games that Lone Survivor takes a lot of inspiration from, that being the Silent Hill series. So since this is an ending I don't have to explain very much, let's quickly go into some final points of miscellaneous thoughts. Who is everyone we meet in the game, and are they even real? Well, going over every NPC one at a time very quickly, the man in the blue, Draco, isn't real right now, or at least the way you might think. Again, he has the potential to become you if you give in to your survival instincts and make choices that hurt your sanity. Chi and her friends I don't think are real either, but probably were at one point. Benzito interestingly tells us to go home to our parents, which makes me wonder if this isn't a group of people pulled from our childhood memories, or implies the people here, Chi included, are a generation or so older than you. I'm not trying to get onto a tangent here. It's just the apartment party, while very clearly a hallucination, doesn't give a lot of information about the people inside of its role in the grand scheme of things. Moving on, the man with the box on his head is not real. He obviously appears in your dreams where we can see his red tie flowing in the wind, and for a long time, people also thought that this was you since you appears to wear a tie throughout the game. And while it doesn't destroy the theory outright, the red on your shirt is actually a flashlight, not a tie, which is best seen in the intro where you first get the flashlight. I think the man with the box on his head again represents nurture, but I think he is also the current figurative representation of you's mind. He has a box on his head, and while he has knowledge that we the player don't have, much like you, he also seems confused and lost. This is made a little more transparent with his dream state being in the desert, a place that throughout the game confuses the protagonist and mirrors the amnesia that these two both seem to have. There's also some debate over whether or not the man with the box on his head is the director, since in the director's apartment he's always next to a box that's identical to the one that's on the box man's head, but I'm unsure if that's true, and now knowing the rest of the story, I have to say it doesn't really seem to matter whether he is or not. Hank, I actually think is real, and also plays into another answer to a question I have coming up shortly. A long time ago, I would have said that Hank wasn't real. It was only meant to be a vessel to mirror your own mental state as you and how you treat others. But now with the next Lone game announced, I don't think that's the case. The next game coming out in the Lone World universe is Lone Warrior and acts as a prequel to Lone Survivor, while not necessarily featuring characters that we've seen so far. Well, that is except for the protagonist, that being Hank. This is another time where I have to say it's not mentioned that it's Hank anywhere, but it's the same model as him, and it's taking place in a subway metro, so come on. And I think the fact that we'll be playing as Hank means that he pretty much has to be real. The director I don't think is real either. I think he represents a part of you's psyche that's trying desperately to give you the tools to survive in this world without compromising your morals. Throughout the game, the director keeps mentioning how he doesn't need any of the items he gives you, and he's basically safe in this apocalypse, and asks you several times to think about why that would be the case. You asks if it's because he's a figment of his imagination, to which the director acts indignant and says that he's real enough. But my question to you, audience, is if you weren't real, do you think that you'd think you were real? Then of course, since the director seems to know her in the ending, and likely mirrors her in his death, I think it's pretty safe to say that he isn't real. The white-faced man is the only person left, and again, I think he obviously isn't real. I think he just represents truth, and is supposed to be a hint for the player at the end of the game that the endings you're seeing are the truth, as you see him for the third and final time. Interestingly, he has a blue tie on, in inverse to the man with the box's red tie, and the man with the white face promises answers, while the man with the box on his head is cryptic. So there are some more parallels and contrasts, but not anything worth beating your head into a wall over. Moving on to another important question, are the events of the game even real, and to what degree? So, I think that the monsters and the infection are real, and I've made clear which characters I think are real and which ones aren't. And there are some points in the game that are clearly hallucinations or memories depending on which characters show up and how they act. A popular theory for this game has been that the game takes place in a psych ward of some kind, and that's why the end of the game has you taking pills and includes a psych report. But given the rest of the game, the pills just seem to be an overlooked thematic decision for the endings. And again, the monsters being something that now two different real people, that being you and Hank, have seen now leads me to believe it's real, or at least as real as the other world is in the Silent Hill games. But I alluded to something earlier, let's go ahead and address it to wrap up the video. Is the protagonist infected? Well, let's refer to that list of symptoms I mentioned at the beginning of the game, and you tell me what you think. Itchiness, loss of appetite, confusion, loss of memory, sensitivity to light, aggressive behavior, headaches, vivid night terrors, slurred speech, fatigue, twitchiness, and disassociation from reality. I think some of the symptoms mentioned here are either specific to physical transmission, like itchiness, or are symptoms that happen later in the infection. Otherwise, it seems to me that you is a perfect case for this infection in the early stages of it. Much like how Hank is able to beat his infection with willpower and medicine, I do think we're able to combat the infection and its hold on us through living a healthy lifestyle and fighting the mental hang-ups brought on by the disease. It's far from being the main point I'm trying to push in this lore video, but just something that kept coming to mind whenever you realize that the infection is airborne as well, and that Yu's symptoms mirror a lot of Hank's symptoms described in his escape diary. Otherwise, I think that's about all there is to say about Lone Survivor and its story. The re-release kind of went under the radar for a game that was at one time covered by a lot of really prominent YouTubers, and is what I personally consider one of the first and one of the best survival horror games in the modern sense of the word. Jasper Byrne uses the money from the big gaming projects that he does to work on freeware available to everyone, and more recently to continue his indie dev career. Not that those are good reasons on their own to buy the game, but if you're looking for another reason other than, it's a good game, there you go. The link to the game is in the description below. If you like survival horror, you should check out this one that helps set the standard for that genre. Otherwise, as usual, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this lore video, as it's one I've been inspired to do long before this channel even existed. So one of my main goals for YouTube has finally been realized. I'll see you all next week. Later.